Hello and welcome to another episode of our series, State of the Election. You may have noticed some of the polls that have come out recently that show former Vice President Joe Biden beating Donald Trump by a pretty good margin. So in this video, we're going to take a look at some of those polls and what they mean for President Trump's re-election bid. We'll also take a look at some of the other current events related to 2020 that have made the headlines in recent days, and discuss how they can impact the election. Before we get into the episode, if you want to check out the other episodes in our State of the Election series, then there's a link to the playlist in the description. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified whenever we post. Currently, only about a third of you are subscribed, and it would really help us out, so do us a favour and tap the button. Thanks for your support. Before we get into the actual numbers, a word on polling. Polls work by taking a sample of the population and having them answer a survey of questions to determine how they might vote in an election. Now, there's three main points here to consider. Firstly, polling is only a sample of the population, but generally speaking, polls give a pretty good picture of how the population feels towards a candidate. Secondly, as with any statistical measure, there can be outliers. That said, aggregated polls are probably a better measure of the standing of a candidate, but even then, they have their downsides. Aggregates have to make sure that the polls they're aggregating are all considering the same information. If questions are worded dramatically differently from one poll to the next, it could certainly affect the outcome of your data. And thirdly, polls consider two types of people: likely voters and registered voters. The problem with registered voters is that they're just, registered. And while they certainly can't vote without being registered, it doesn't mean that they will actually vote. Now, none of us here at TLDR News are statisticians, and we're certainly not saying that you should ignore polling data. I mean, we wouldn't be talking about them if they weren't important. We're simply saying that polls are not a definitive way of predicting an election, and particularly almost 6 months away from election day. Anyway, if you'd like us to do a more detailed video on the validity of polls and how they work, then like this video and drop a comment below to let us know. So, why are we concentrating on polling so much? Well, last week CNN published a poll that showed former Vice President Joe Biden leading President Donald Trump by 14 points. And that's a pretty big margin. Now, as we discussed a moment ago, this could be an outlier, and it probably is. In fact, it's also worth noting that Hillary Clinton held a similar lead to Donald Trump at this point in the 2016 election campaign. However, at the time of writing, the Real Clear Politics average had Joe Biden ahead by an 8.5 point lead. So there's no question that at least now, Joe Biden definitely has the upper hand. Now, while we're discussing polling, we definitely need to point out that after the 2016 election, some said that polling couldn't be trusted. But remember, most of the polls we see are done nationwide and don't take into account the system of the Electoral College. Now, a video on how the Electoral College works is in the pipeline, so we won't go into a lot of detail now. But it's this system that awards electoral votes based on the popular vote in each state. In essence, the United States has 51 popular votes in the states and the District of Columbia when a presidential election is held. Thus, national polls are only useful to get the national outcome. And in 2016, they did get it right. In the final result, Hillary Clinton bested Donald Trump in the national vote by nearly 2 percentage points, while polls showed her as 3 points ahead on the eve of the election. Donald Trump simply won the presidency because he got enough votes in key states to swing those particular popular elections, and thus win their Electoral College votes. Now, there's one other thing worth noting in regard to predicting the election. While polls and current events certainly play a role, all political analysts and pundits base some of their analysis and prediction of elections on previous election cycles and the conventional wisdom of US politics. In fact, we're no exception. We reference historical examples many times in our videos, even in this election series. However, the thing to remember is that in this particular election, there are some historic firsts. The pandemic, for example, is definitely a first. The United States has never intentionally shut down its entire economy for a length of time, let alone gone through the process of trying to open it back up again. We still don't know the shutdown's long-term effects on the economy, and therefore, we certainly don't know its impact on the election. There have been a few other developments that could also have a significant impact on the election. Let's start with the Supreme Court. Yesterday, the Supreme Court issued a ruling on the controversial Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program. And the ruling in the court halted the Trump administration's attempts to terminate the program. DACA itself is a program that was started under President Obama that offers protections to immigrants that were brought to the US as children through no fault of their own. But it wasn't the authority of the administration to end the program that the court questioned, rather the way the administration went about it. As Chief Justice John Roberts wrote in the opinion, the dispute before the court is not whether the DHS can rescind DACA. All parties agree that it may. The dispute is instead primarily about the procedure the agency followed in doing so. Anyway, this ruling on DACA follows another significant ruling this week, in which the court said that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does indeed offer protection of discrimination to the LGBTQ+ community. If you'd like to know more about that, then check out our video on the topic. There's a link in the description. So what do these rulings mean for Trump's re-election? Well, most likely, not much. The DACA ruling, while a setback, doesn't mean that he can't end the program. The administration does now have the option of trying to comply with the court standards. In fact, after the court's ruling, President Trump tweeted, "As President of the United States, I am asking for a legal solution on DACA, not a political one, consistent with the rule of law. The Supreme Court is not willing to give us one, so we now have to start this process all over again." The fact that he doesn't want a political solution means that he doesn't want to go back to Congress, most likely because he knows that as long as Congress is splitting control between the two major parties, finding a political solution will be next to impossible. So overall, it's probably not the rulings we know about yet that will have a major effect on the election, but rather the ones we don't know about yet. The court is set to determine whether Congress can legally request the president's tax returns. We won't speculate on that here, but that decision could significantly impact the presidential campaign. There's two final factors we want to address: Joe Biden's running mate and the upcoming release of former National Security Advisor John Bolton's book. Now, we know that there hasn't been a decision yet on Joe Biden's running mate, but we thought it was important to point out that the Veep stakes is still happening, and it could have a huge impact on the election, especially considering Biden's age. And with the recent protests and riots surrounding the murder of George Floyd, Biden is under increased pressure to choose a woman of colour. So that's certainly something we'll be looking at as he makes his selection, which is said to be coming at the end of July or beginning of August. And as you've probably guessed by now, we have two videos on this topic, both of which are linked below. John Bolton's book will certainly have an impact on the election, as it contains several claims that, frankly, cast President Trump in a rather poor light. In his memoir, The Room Where It Happened, Bolton claims that discussions took place about replacing Vice President Pence with former Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley on the 2020 ticket. In an even more bizarre twist, Bolton alleges that President Trump even requested the Chinese President Xi Jinping helped his re-election bid by asking China to buy more US agricultural products. Bolton even went as far to say that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo slipped him a note that read, "He's so full of shit." These, among several other claims in the book, may very well damage President Trump's chances at re-election. It just depends on how the electorate receives this information. However, we do also have to keep in mind that Donald Trump's defining characteristic in his political life is that he's always defied conventional wisdom and appears able to weather any scandal. Anyway, we'll certainly keep you up to date as this election plays out, so be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified whenever we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible.